encore will actually deal with roughly with some centennial material. That was its intention from the beginning. And that beginning actually, in reference to my latest book, which deals with a single squadron in the French air service, a rather typical fighter squadron of mid-1917 through 1918, which would be attached to a unit called Groupe de Combat 18, which I will not be covering in this case, since that was one of a generation that came together in early 1918, but I am very much going to be dealing with its predecessor formations, because what I am going to deal with is roughly the centennial of gathering the fighters as a means of establishing local air superiority. It was another step in the evolution of aircraft in general and fighters in particular. And it happened in roughly a 2 to 4 month period in the autumn, late summer, early autumn of 1916. As most of you probably know from past lectures, once the airplane was taken seriously and the pilots began to get a bit more earnest in jealously guarding their section of sky so that their reconnaissance aircraft could see the enemy and deny the enemy from doing the same thing in their stretch of front, more specialized aircraft were being developed, such as the Vickers FB-5, a two-seater which had a front gunner manning a Lewis gun, and whose appearance over the front with number 11 Squadron marked the first specialized fighter squadron to make an appearance, albeit with a two-seat pusher. I almost had it. And the Germans made the next step when Anthony Fokker installed a synchronized machine gun in his Fokker E1, followed by the improved E2 and E3, which became the scourge of the Western Front from approximately August 1915 until well into 1916. The Allies responded with various means, of which one of the most effective was the Nieuport 11 Bebe, which was a smaller version of a single-seat version of the Nieuport 10 single-seater. Both mounted a Lewis gun above the pilot that could be pulled back to replace the ammunition drum by hand and then put back up there, and if the pilot was adept enough at taking into consideration that what he saw on the sight was rather lower than where the machine gun was, he could shoot something down. More important, the Nieuport, being a sesquiplane, had a single spar wing at the bottom which made for better visibility below, but also allowed one to brace the upper wing by means of wires and make for a more rigid structure than you'd have with a wire-braced monoplane like the Fokker E3. And the result was a somewhat sturdier and more maneuverable airplane, on top of which the Nieuport had ailerons rather than wing warping, and that helped. So the only advantage that the E3 had at that point was that it was a simple point and shoot, whereas the Nieuport, you had to have the skill to deal with a machine gun that was above you. And the two canceled each other out, and the first really major air battle over the Battle of Verdun in 1916. And Commandant Charles Tricorneau de Rose, shown in his own Nieuport, he was the father of French fighter aviation, and it was he who pretty much had his role defined by him on February 28th, 1916, when General Henri-Philippe Pétain asked him to his headquarters and said, "Rose, I am blind. Sweep the skies for me." Well, given de Rose's nature, Pétain didn't have to tell him twice. And he devoted himself to trying to find the best possible way of accomplishing that. One of his methods was to come up with the first single-seat fighter squadron, N.12, which started on single-seat versions of the Nieuport 10 and started acquiring more specialized single-seaters in the form of the Nieuport 11 Bebe and the Morane-Saulnier NM, which was an abominable idea that had coexisted with the overwing Nieuport. It had, in fact, been based on the concept of the first single-seat fighter back in April 1915 when Roland Garros had installed a Hotchkiss machine gun on a modified Morane-Saulnier L two-seater, modified into a single-seater, and with steel deflectors on the propeller so that instead of shooting the propeller off, they would deflect off the steel wedges. A smaller, more streamlined version was the NM, and it is shown here with French ace Jean Navarre in the cockpit while he was serving in N12. He had already scored 2 victories in Morane-Saulnier L two-seat parasols. His third victory would be in this Model N. And it would also be the first single-seat victory for N12. So we now have about 10 to 12 fighters gathered in a squadron, and it would not be long before more would be re-equipped. The first to be fully equipped with the Bebe would be N.31 around January 1916, just in time for the Battle of Verdun. And here is a view of N.31. Jean Chaput flew this plane to shoot down an Eindecker on April 30th, 1916. This should give you an idea of the improvised nature of these early attempts at air superiority. Notice that the gun sight consists basically of a loop suspended between cross wires in front of the forward cabane struts. And that was partly how Chaput aimed his upper gun. And yet, in spite of the fact, call it skill or call it luck, but as he was jinking again after this diving E3, his gun jammed after one shot. He cleared it, it jammed again, he cleared it again, all this in a dive, fired off 3 more shots, and it jammed once and for all, and the E3 went down and crashed, and its pilot died of his injuries. Here's another specially formed unit that had come together in April 1916. I think you may recognize it by the collection of personal motifs by which its pilots identified themselves on each plane. This is escadrille N.124, whose, aside from the commander, Capitaine Georges Tenot, and the executive officer, Lieutenant de l'Age de Meaux, Alfred de l'Age de Meaux. It was entirely made up of American volunteers through the Foreign Legion. They were known to the French as l'escadrille américaine until the German embassy in the U.S. put up a stink over it, and they were told to change the name to l'escadrille des volontaires, which the pilots found boring. And they replaced it with something a little more evocative while at the same time metaphoric, l'escadrille Lafayette. These fellows had their debut over Verdun in May-June 1916 with mixed results, but they also contributed to the might of the French, and the numbers of which largely suppressed German attempts to reconnoiter over the front. And at the same time, the British were introducing an entire squadron of single-seaters. Once again, they were pushers, de Havilland DH-2s, under the command of one of their most aggressive aces, Major Leno G. Hawker. This was number 24 Squadron, and it opened things in March 1916 and was well practiced by July 1st, 1916, when it was fully committed to battle, in this case with one token Morane-Saulnier, for reasons that elude me entirely, considering the fact that the DH-2 was rather a better plane. But to give you an idea of Hawker's attitude, his orders on that first day of the Somme push was a two-word order: attack everything. And the Germans were again rather thrown for a loop by all this. What were the Germans doing at this point to counter this gathering of Allied aircraft? Well, they had improvised units that they called Kampfeinsatzkommandos, in which detachments from Fliegerabteilungen would be devoted to providing escort or perhaps driving off enemy reconnaissance planes. This may make up anywhere from 2 to maybe 5, maybe even 6 aircraft at a time. They weren't particularly permanent. They were put in certain areas like Metz, for example, and assigned to whatever, alongside whatever Fliegerabteilungen were around. And they also employed what was at Verdun, what were called Sperre tactics, of having all the planes up at once, patrolling the front, looking for Frenchmen to shoot down, whether they be two-seaters or Fokker or Pfalz Eindeckers. Well, one person thought that this was a waste of men and resources when he arrived at the Verdun front at Jametz, and that was an already experienced Fokker pilot named Hauptmann Oswald Boelke. Boelke suggested that he be given a free hand with maybe a wingman, set up a tent and 2 Eindeckers near the front, and have telephone lines running in from all the local troops at the front line trenches, and if any of them sees a French reconnaissance plane coming along, to phone it into him. He and his wingman would take off forthwith and head wherever they were needed. It would save fuel, it would save wear and tear on the planes, and they might actually shoot something down. Well, this was astonishingly effective for the amount of people it involved, and Boelke added considerably to his score at this time. One of his victims may have been Victor Chapman, who was wounded in a dogfight with him, although Boelke did not see him crash and therefore modestly did not even put in for it, but he mentioned the incident in his diary. Belka's tactics were very effective, and by the time he was taken off the front for a rest leave, he promptly began writing down a set of tactics that became known as dicta Belka, and which are still used by fighter pilots to this day. Now here's an example of a Kampfeinsitzer Kommando, in this case 4 E4s and E3s under Lieutenant Kurt Student, who would end up with 6 victories and whose leadership qualities would be redirected in World War II as commander of the Fallschirmjäger, or paratroops for the Luftwaffe. Nevertheless, by the end of the Battle of Verdun and in the midst of the Battle of the Somme, the Germans could see that the Fokker Eindecker's days were more than numbered. Rudolf Berthold wrote in the midsummer of 1916, "We had too few qualified monoplanes. We lacked an aircraft that was easily maneuverable in combat. We had fallen asleep on the laurel wreaths that single-seaters in the hands of a few superlative pilots had achieved. It was not the monoplane itself, but the pilots who were responsible for the success. One need not compare the number of Fokker fighters at the front with those few pilots who had victories. I had already requested a new type of aircraft in January 1916, a small biplane. People laughed. The Frenchman, meanwhile, takes our experience to heart, quietly builds small biplanes and launches hundreds at once against our lines. He has achieved air superiority, and with grinding teeth we must watch while he shoots down our monoplanes, and we're helpless." Well, finally, somebody in Germany got the hint, because in June of 1916, the first Halberstadt D1s and D2s began appearing at the front. The Halberstadt was a true biplane. It was much sturdier than the Nieuport with its sesquoplane arrangement, and it was quite maneuverable. It had a single machine gun that was synchronized like the Fokker, but it had much better performance overall. Oswald Belka is second from the right in this picture of Germans looking over one of the newly arrived planes. And it was also about this time that Belka and others began suggesting the idea of a permanent specialized fighter unit like the French and the British already had. Here's another view of the same Halberstadt. The Halberstadt is now considered an important interim transitory fighter because of another that would soon eclipse it, but for the time being it did hold a promise of improving the dismal situation that Rudolf Berthold mentioned, even if he somewhat exaggerates the idea of hundreds of French Nieuports pervading the front. It must have looked that way to the Germans in their KEKs at the time. But in late August, the first German Jagdstaffel, Jasta I, made its appearance with a mixed bag of Halberstadts and Fokker D2 and D3 and D4 biplanes, which were structurally inferior to the Halberstadt, but it was all they had at the time. They even had a few Eindeckers, as we will see. As a matter of fact, Kurt Winkens, who by September 1916 had 18 victories to his credit and the Ordre pour le Mérite, was still flying a Fokker E4 with Jasta I. You can see a Halberstadt in the background, and yet he stuck with the frailer Fokker because it had 2 machine guns and a 160 horsepower twin-row radial engine to get it off the ground. And although the plane's performance was not that good, Belka, for one, didn't particularly like it, the fact that it had 2 machine guns meant that much to Vinkins. The reason being that with a synchronized weapon, whenever the propeller is in front of the machine gun and it's working correctly, it turns off the machine gun, so you're getting a pop, 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 pop. When you have 2 machine guns, there's always one gun that's clear, so you're getting more than double the rate of fire. And he believed in that, and apparently so did somebody else. Incidentally, Vinkins and his E-4 would fall victim to a plane 2 generations removed from it, when on September 25th he was caught by a brand new SPAD 7 flown by Lieutenant Alfred Erteau of Escadrille Spa 3, of which more later. But that was the end of Vinkins. But Robert Talon of the Albatros Werke had come up with a fighter too. A streamlined plywood fuselage beauty with a true biplane wing and 2 machine guns and a 160 horsepower Mercedes engine. It was called the Albatros D1, and it was more of a game changer than the Halberstadt simply because it had 2 machine guns. This specimen was delivered to, I believe, Jasta 5, but the first one was delivered briefly to Jasta 1 before it was transferred to Hauptmann Oswald Belka's Staffel Jasta 2, which ended up eventually being fully equipped with D1s and shortly after that D2s. The main problem the Germans saw with the D1 was that the wing was rather high above the pilot's head and interfered with his vision. So instead of the trestle struts, they established 2 sets of splayed end struts that lowered the wing so that he had a better view above him. This version was called the D2. Both originally had the Tevos and Braun radiators shown in the picture, but those added drag. They were replaced by, those are Windhoff radiators. The Tevos and Braun was a radiator that went on the upper wing flush with it and offered much less wing resistance and made for an overall better plane. Equipped with this unit, Belka really could do some damage, and he quickly drilled into the head of the disciples he assembled had them put to memory some basic rules of fighting. Seek advantage before attacking. If possible, keep the sun at your back. Having begun an attack, always follow through. Only fire at short range and only when your opponent is positively in your sights. Never lose sight of your opponent. Do not be fooled by his tricks. In every attack, it is important to approach your opponent from behind. If your opponent attacks from above, do not try to evade but fly to meet him. Then over enemy territory, never forget your path home. For the Staffel, attack on principle in flights of 4 or 6. When single combat ensues, take care that many do not go for one opponent. These were the basic dicta. And as already mentioned, on September 17th, 1916, Belka had one of his best moments when he, it was pretty much the day that everything came fully together. Lieutenant Evan Burma started the day off at 0745 hours when he brought down a Sopwith 1.5 strutter of number 70 squadron, whose pilot, Second Lieutenant Oswald Nixon, was killed, and the wounded observer, Second Lieutenant R. Wood, taken prisoner. Then at 1100 hours, Belka led 5 of his men toward Allied lines and spotted 4 bomb-carrying BE-2Ds of number 12 squadron heading for Morcoing railway station with an escort of 6 FE-2Bs of number 11 squadron, which had replaced its FB-5s with another 2-seater, the FE-2B. Belka went on to intercept, but the British were already bombing the station when his flight arrived. He decided then to target the FE formation. He held back in order to help anyone who got into trouble, while his other 5 Albatros went in for the kill. Acting in perfect accordance in all that had been drilled into them over the past several weeks, the Germans broke up the FE formation and then it went for lone targets. At that point, with Belka having joined them. Belka picked out the flight leader and quickly forced it to land at Econcourt, where the crew, Captain D.B. Gray and Lieutenant L.B. Helder, managed to set their plane afire before it was captured. Then at 11:35, Lieutenant Hans Reimann forced FE-2B 4844 down south of Trécourt, where Second Lieutenant T.P.L. Malloy and Sergeant G.J. Morton became guests of the Kaiser. A third, a number 7018, was attacked by another of Belka's men, who reported afterward, "I singled out the last machine and fired several times at closest range, 10 meters. Suddenly, the enemy propeller stood stock still. The machine went down, gliding, and followed until I killed the observer, who had not stopped shooting until the last moment. Now my opponent went downwards in sharp curves. At approximately 1200 meters, a second German machine came along and attacked my victim down to the ground, and then landed next to the English plane." It was the first victory of an eventual 80 for Lieutenant Manfred von Richthofen, who found the observer, 21-year-old Second Lieutenant Tom Rees, dead. The pilot, 19-year-old Second Lieutenant Lionel B.F. Morris, died before the ambulance could get him to Cambrai Hospital. As the British tried to make their way westward, they encountered another soon-to-be frequent part of running the gauntlet, being jumped by a second Staffel that had been drawn to the scene. That was Jasta IV, which had been formed on August 25th from Kampfeinsitzer-Kommando Vaux under the command of Oberleutnant Hans-Joachim Budecke and equipped with Halberstadt D2s. As a result, a 4th FE-2B became Lieutenant Wilhelm Frankel's 12th victory. Sergeant J.E. Glover killed, pilot Second Lieutenant H. Thompson dying of wounds soon after. The Germans then set up a new tradition that night when enlisted men were permitted to join the officers in the casino that night to celebrate. Amid the festivities, Belka pinned the Iron Cross First Class on Burma, and Richthofen, who had already received the decoration, wrote a letter that evening to a jeweler in Berlin asking for a plain silver cup 2 inches high and 1 inch wide, on which was inscribed 1 Vickers 2, 17-9-16. This was the inauguration in force of the Jagdgeschwader as a way of gaining local air superiority, and it would be a theme over the front for the rest of the war. Here is a collection of Jasta II aircraft. Among those in the picture would be Richthofen, and this is a collection of D2s with Jasta IX under Student facing the French. Well, at this point, the French had been responding to the appearance of these German squadrons in their own way. During the Battle of Verdun, in fact, before his death on May 21st in a crash, Tricornor de Rose had brought the best of the available escadrille together for a coordinated effort. N.12, N.15, 31, 65, 67, 69, and 124, as well as a detachment from N.3. These were put through various organizations. For example, on May 22nd, pilots picked from a number of them were put together for a coordinated effort to shoot down a dozen balloons over the front, and most of them got their victim during that. But these were temporary organizations. They would be transferred to various places and gathered and coordinated as needed. But then on October 16th, 1916, and here's where we get to our centennial, folks, the French decided to form a permanent grouping of some of their elite units to travel from area to area wherever they'd be most needed. And the ones that they chose, for starters, for what would be called Groupe de Combat 11, under Chef d'Escadron Auguste Le Révérend, would be N.12, N.31, N.48, and N.57. The group became fully operational as such on November 1st. On the same day, another such unit, GC-12, was formed of N3, N26, N.73, and N.103. On February 6, 1917, GC-13 was put together under Capitaine Philippe Fécamp with N.65, 67, and 124. This organization would be rearranged on October 1st, 1917 with a trade-off of units, and would end up consisting of N.65, N.84, N.88, and N.124, which by then was the Escadrille Lafayette. Another unit formed on March 17, 1917, would be Groupe de Combat 14 under Capitaine Robert Massenet-Royer de Marancourt, consisting of N.75, N.80, N.83, and N.86. The very next day, GC-14 had its opening kill on March 18th when a member of N.80, Caporal Jan Hoffmann, a Bohemian who had volunteered for French service in hopes that his country would be liberated by an Allied victory to form an independent Czech nation, took on a German aviatic, may have suffered a jam. In any case, Hoffmann was seen to deliberately ram the plane, killing himself and its crew, Vizefeldwebel Ernst Rittmeister and Leutnant der Reserve Heinrich Sauer of Fliegerabteilung Artillery 262. So the first victory for this unit was a sacrifice, but one for which Hoffmann, the only Czech to die in aerial combat on the Allied side in World War I, gave them their first victory, but at the cost of his own life. Another somewhat less frequent aspect of these groupings occurred with GC-12 under Commandant Antonin Brocard. Brocard had been the commander of N3, which had already become famous since June for the stork that was painted on the side of its Nieupors, representing Alsace-Lorraine and the liberation thereof. With the formation of a group of these units, they eventually would adopt storks in various modes of flight for all 4 units, thus replacing, for example, the red star of N.103 or the torch of N.26. Another event that occurred that is symbolized by 2 of the gentlemen I've just shown. The previous one was Armand Pinsard, who was the first person to receive a SPAD 7 in late August 1916, S-122, while he was with Escadrille 23. The black plane he was shown in front of was with N.78, which he would later command when he scored his most of his 28 victories. N3, of course, would also receive some of these early SPAD 7s, which were true biplanes and much more sturdy than the Nieuport, as well as much more powerful, with a 150 horsepower Hispano-Suiza engine and a synchronized machine gun. Among the early people to receive it was Sergeant Georges Guinemer, already an ace in Nieuports, and he soon shot down several Germans in his first plane, S-115, before ironically being brought down by a French anti-aircraft gun that mistook it for a German plane and brought the thing crashing down. Guinemer suffered an injured knee, but otherwise was very impressed by the fact that he was still alive. As he wrote to his father, "The SPAD is solid. Were it not, I would be thinner than this sheet of paper." And he became a believer of the SPAD from then on. Nevertheless, N3 continued to mix its SPADs and Nieuports for several months. This is one flown by Captain Alfred Auger, who would end up with 7 victories before he was killed in action. And another exponent of the Nieuport 17 shown here, and later the SPAD 7, René Dorme of N3, a man who lived for revenge and who was officially credited with 23 victories before he was killed in action in May 1917. But it was believed that he had about twice as many that were unconfirmed that he just didn't give a damn about. This is the remains of Noël de Rochefort's Nieuport after he was brought down by the Germans and mortally wounded. He had scored 6 victories with N.26, and it shows the torch emblem that N.26 originally used before it was replaced by a stork in a sort of an attitude that suggested more a Japanese crane, which had been allegedly designed by a Japanese member of the unit, Captain Baron Kiyotake Shigeno. And here is a Nieuport 17 of N.103, a former Voisin bombing unit that switched to fighters, and you can just barely make out the red star on the side of its camouflage fuselage. This too was replaced with a stork in yet another attitude of flight. And this is Carl, this is gone ornery on me again. I don't know how I got out of it. Here's another example of some of the early aces. This is Georges Ortoli, a Corsican, with N.31, showing their archer emblem, Greek archer, and his personal number 13. He would end up with 12 victories by the end of the war. Well, so the French were, by 1917, were not only gathering squadrons, but groups to gain local superiority over the front. And this presented a new challenge, potential challenge to the Germans, in spite of the fact that at Staffel level, as long as they cooperated well enough, they were doing astonishingly well against the French and the British alike. And this would become particularly noteworthy when it came to the British taking on a concentration of German Staffeln during the April 1917 offensive, in which the Germans ended up shooting down 3 times as many British as they lost, largely attributable to some crack units like Jasta 11 and 12. And Jasta 11 had gotten a new commander in January 1917 in the person of the fellow on the bike, Oberleutnant Manfred von Richthofen, who painted his own plane all red and set an example by shooting down his 17th victim of the Staffel's first over an FE8, but pretty soon had whipped his unit into the most effective one over the Western Front by the end of April, during which his many victories included 4 in one day. Nevertheless, Richthofen, an avid disciple of the late Oswald Belke, could see the value of what the French were doing, and in late June, around June 28, 1917, he too formed what was called a Jagdgeschwader, or fighter wing, permanently grouping Jastas 4, 6, 10, and 11 as a unit that would, like GC-12, be going wherever it was needed at the front. It was so much on the move, in fact, that some observers thought it looked like a traveling circus as its trucks went from place to place. And pretty soon, between that and the colorful markings that had been adopted by each unit, the black and white tail stripes of 6, the yellow noses of 10, the red noses of 11, and the wound black stripe down the fuselage of Jasta 4, the British soon began calling it the Red Baron's Flying Circus. So by the summer of 1917, here's another Staffel of a more independent variety at the time, Jasta 30, but still showing the principle in action. The front was now ready for some serious air battles involving not merely squadrons but entire groups, and later on British wings consisting of several fighter squadrons being unleashed at each other in force. True air battles were now taking place, and what had once seemed like a casual acquisition of local air superiority was becoming air battle in earnest. And at each section of the front, and in this case, more than one Staffel would be ready to unleash its planes in force as needed on call. As Belke had been with his 2 at Verdun, now it would be up to 30 to 40 at a time. In this case, Jagdgeschwader I with Jasta 11 in the 4, and the second from the front being the all-red plain of you-know-who. The stage was set for the huge air battles that would mark 1917 through 1918. Any questions?